The Great Wall of China stretches across thousands of miles of Chinese landscape, representing centuries of human labor and ingenuity. But there's one claim about this ancient wonder that's been repeated so many times, it's become accepted as absolute fact. The problem is, it's completely wrong. For decades, people have stated that the Great Wall of China is the only man-made structure visible from space. This supposed fact has been repeated in classrooms, documentaries, and casual conversations around the world. It sounds perfectly reasonable. After all, the wall is incredibly long and represents a massive human achievement. Surely something that impressive must be visible from the cosmos. The reality is far less impressive for anyone hoping to spot ancient Chinese architecture from orbit. Astronauts who have actually been to space have repeatedly confirmed that you cannot see the Great Wall from the moon with the naked eye. In fact, you can't even reliably spot it from low Earth orbit without assistance. The wall may be thousands of miles long, but it's only about 20 feet wide. Trying to see it from space would be like attempting to spot a single strand of hair from across a football field. This myth persisted for so long because it was born in an era before space travel was possible. People could make grand claims about what would be visible from space because nobody could actually go up there and check. By the time we had astronauts regularly orbiting the planet, the myth had become so entrenched that it took years of repeated debunking to make any dent in public consciousness. Even today, you'll still hear people confidently repeating this completely false claim. The second lie on our list takes us deep beneath the streets of New York City into the labyrinthine sewer system that keeps the city functioning. According to urban legend, these dark tunnels are home to colonies of massive albino alligators, the descendants of pet reptiles that were flushed down toilets when they became too large to handle. These sewer-dwelling monsters supposedly thrived in the warm, dark environment, growing to enormous sizes and losing their pigmentation from generations of living without sunlight. This story has all the elements of a perfect urban myth. It's just plausible enough to seem possible, involves exotic pets and irresponsible owners, and creates a delicious sense of hidden danger lurking beneath our feet. The tale became so popular that it inspired books, movies, and countless retellings around campfires and at slumber parties. Unfortunately for horror movie fans, there's absolutely no evidence that colonies of giant albino alligators have ever existed in New York sewers. Despite decades of maintenance workers, inspectors, and city employees navigating every inch of the underground system, not a single population of these legendary reptiles has ever been discovered. The practical problems with this myth are immediately obvious once you think about it. What would these alligators eat in a sewer system? How would they survive the harsh winters when the underground temperature drops significantly? The persistence of this myth reveals something interesting about how we process information. We're far more likely to remember and repeat stories that are dramatic and unusual, even when they're completely fabricated, than we are to remember boring but accurate information about actual sewer maintenance and urban infrastructure. Our third historical deception involves one of the most famous secret societies in conspiracy theory lore. The Illuminati has become synonymous with shadowy global control, pulling strings behind every major world event from a hidden boardroom somewhere. According to countless conspiracy theories, this all-powerful organization controls governments, economies, media, and possibly your internet connection. They're supposedly behind everything from wars to stock market crashes to the cancellation of your favorite television show. The reality of the historical Illuminati is almost hilariously underwhelming compared to their mythical reputation. The Bavarian Illuminati was indeed a real organization founded in 1776 by a German law professor. But rather than being a world-dominating cabal of evil masterminds, they were essentially an intellectual discussion group focused on Enlightenment ideals like reason, secularism, and individual liberty. These supposed puppet masters of global civilization couldn't even manage to keep their own organization running for more than a decade. The Bavarian government shut them down in the 1780s, and the group dissolved completely. The idea that this short-lived academic society somehow survived in secret and went on to control world events is like claiming your high school debate club is secretly running the United Nations. The modern Illuminati conspiracy theories are a perfect example of how a small grain of historical truth can be transformed into an elaborate fantasy through decades of embellishment and paranoid speculation. The real Illuminati were probably more concerned with philosophical discussions and university politics than with manipulating global affairs. Moving from secret societies to religious legends, our fourth lie involves one of Ireland's most beloved patron saints. St. Patrick is celebrated every March with parades, green beer, and stories of his miraculous achievement in driving all the snakes out of Ireland. According to the legend, this holy man used his spiritual powers to banish every serpent from the Emerald Isle, making it safe for the faithful and establishing his reputation as a miracle worker. This story has become so central to Irish cultural identity that questioning it almost feels sacrilegious. The image of St. Patrick standing on a hilltop, commanding legions of snakes to slither into the sea, is both dramatic and spiritually satisfying. It represents the triumph of Christianity over paganism, good over evil, order over chaos. The problem with this inspiring tale is that there were never any snakes in post-glacial Ireland to begin with. The island was separated from mainland Europe by rising sea levels after the last ice age, long before snakes could migrate there naturally. St. Patrick didn't perform a miracle by driving out snakes because there weren't any snakes to drive out in the first place. The snake story is actually a brilliant piece of medieval metaphorical storytelling. The serpents represented the pagan religions and druidic traditions that St. Patrick worked to replace with Christianity during his missionary work. He didn't literally banish reptiles, he symbolically banished the old beliefs. Somewhere along the way, this powerful metaphor was taken literally, and a routine religious conversion became an epic, monster-slaying adventure. Our fifth deception takes us into the world of alcohol and artistic inspiration. Absinthe, known as the Green Fairy, became legendary among 19th and early 20th century artists and writers for its supposed hallucinogenic properties. This emerald-coloured spirit was blamed for inducing vivid visions, creative frenzies, and various forms of madness among the bohemian communities of Europe. The drink became so associated with dangerous psychoactive effects that it was banned in most countries for nearly a century. Famous artists like Vincent van Gogh, Henri de Toulouse-Lautrec, and Oscar Wilde were all known absinthe drinkers, and their erratic behaviour and mental health struggles were often attributed to the supposedly mind-altering effects of their favourite beverage. The Green Fairy was portrayed as a dangerous muse that could unlock creative genius at the cost of sanity and social stability. The entire reputation of absinthe as a hallucinogenic substance was built on a foundation of corporate rivalry and clever marketing manipulation. The French wine industry was losing business to the popular green spirit and launched a systematic campaign to demonize their competition. They spread rumors about absinthe's dangerous properties and lobbied for legislation to ban it, effectively eliminating a business rival through fabricated health scares. Absinthe does contain a compound called thujone, which is found in wormwood, one of its key ingredients. However, the amount of thujone in properly made absinthe is far too small to produce any psychoactive effects. You would literally die from alcohol poisoning long before consuming enough thujone to experience any hallucinogenic effects. Those artists weren't having profound visions from their absinthe consumption. They were simply drunk and possibly suffering from the various mental health issues and substance abuse problems that were already affecting their lives. The absinthe myth persisted for so long because it perfectly fit the romantic image of the tortured artist driven to madness by their pursuit of creative inspiration. The truth that these individuals were just regular alcoholics consuming a drink that was no more dangerous than any other high-proof spirit was far less dramatically satisfying than the legend of the mystical Green Fairy. Our sixth historical fabrication leads us into the seemingly innocent world of nature documentaries and wildlife education. For generations, Schoolchildren have learned about the tragic phenomenon of lemming mass suicide, where these small Arctic rodents allegedly march in massive groups toward cliff tops and leap to their deaths in the ocean below. This behavior was presented as a mysterious instinct, a natural population control mechanism that prevented overpopulation in harsh northern environments. The image of thousands of lemmings following each other off a precipice became a powerful metaphor for mindless conformity and groupthink. People would reference lemming behavior when describing everything from stock market crashes to political movements, using these tiny mammals as a symbol of how individuals can be swept up in collective madness that leads to destruction. The disturbing truth behind this widely accepted natural phenomenon reveals one of the most cynical deceptions in documentary history. Lemmings do not commit mass suicide. This entire behavioral myth was literally manufactured by film crews working on a nature documentary. The producers needed dramatic footage for their project, but couldn't capture the spectacular mass death events they wanted to show their audiences. Their solution was both creative and deeply unethical. They purchased lemmings from suppliers, transported them to a filming location overlooking a body of water, and then physically forced the animals off the cliff using brooms and other tools. The resulting footage showed what appeared to be natural lemming suicide behavior, but was actually animal cruelty orchestrated specifically for entertainment purposes. The documentary won awards and helped cement the lemming suicide myth in popular consciousness for decades. Viewers had no reason to suspect that what they were watching was completely staged, especially since it was presented as factual wildlife observation. The myth became so entrenched that it continued to be taught in schools and referenced in popular culture long after the deception was exposed. Moving from manufactured animal behavior to artificially created market demand, our seventh lie involves one of the most successful marketing campaigns in human history. The diamond engagement ring tradition, which billions of people now consider an essential part of romantic commitment, is actually a 20th century invention designed to sell more jewelry. For most of human history, diamonds were not particularly valued or considered especially rare. They were just another gemstone among many, without the mystical significance or astronomical prices we associate with them today. The transformation of diamonds from ordinary stones to symbols of eternal love represents one of the most effective examples of manufactured desire in commercial history. A single company fundamentally altered global culture through strategic marketing and artificial scarcity. They gained control over diamond supplies worldwide, deliberately restricting the amount of stones released to the market to drive up prices. But controlling supply was only half the strategy. They also needed to create demand where none had previously existed. The solution came through hiring advertising agencies that crafted campaigns associating diamonds with romance, commitment, and social status. They invented the tradition of diamond engagement rings and promoted the idea that the size and quality of the stone reflected the depth of a man's love for his future wife. The slogan they created became one of the most recognizable in advertising history, embedding itself so deeply in popular culture that people forgot it was ever just a marketing message. The campaign was so successful that it created an entirely new social expectation. Within a few decades, couples began to feel that their engagements were incomplete without diamond rings, and the jewelry industry had successfully convinced consumers that these artificially scarce stones were essential symbols of authentic love and commitment. Our eighth deception takes us into the world of literary history and popular culture's tendency to create memorable quotes that famous figures never actually said. One of the most recognizable phrases in detective fiction has become so associated with its supposed speaker that most people would bet their lives he actually said it. The brilliant detective with his magnifying glass and deductive reasoning powers has become an icon of intellectual problem solving. His most famous catchphrase perfectly captures his analytical approach and condescending attitude toward his loyal companion. The line has been referenced countless times in other works, parodied in comedy sketches, and quoted by fans of mystery fiction around the world. The phrase combines the detective's signature exclamation of dismissive simplicity with his characteristic address to his friend and chronicler. It seems to perfectly encapsulate both characters and their relationship, which is probably why it became so memorable and widely quoted. The problem is that this iconic line never appears in any of the original stories written by the character's creator. While the detective does use both phrases separately in various stories, they are never combined into the single memorable quote that everyone associates with him. The famous line was actually created decades later in theatrical adaptations and early film versions of the stories. These productions needed snappy dialogue that would work well on stage and screen, so they created combinations of existing phrases that sounded more dramatic and quotable than anything in the original texts. This represents a fascinating example of how popular culture can retroactively edit literary history. The created quote became so popular and seemed so perfectly in character that it was absorbed into the collective understanding of who this fictional detective was and how he spoke. Most people encountering the original stories today are surprised to discover that their favorite quote doesn't actually appear in the source material. Our ninth historical fabrication involves one of the most persistent myths about medieval knowledge and scientific understanding. According to popular belief, people in the Middle Ages were universally ignorant and superstitious, convinced that the earth was flat and that anyone sailing too far from shore would tumble off the edge of the world into a cosmic abyss. This supposed medieval ignorance has been used to contrast the Enlightenment and scientific progress of later eras, creating a narrative of human intellectual development from darkness into light. The flat earth belief has become symbolic of everything we consider backward and unscientific about pre-modern thinking, representing the triumph of reason over religious dogma and superstition. The reality of medieval scientific knowledge completely contradicts this popular misconception. Educated people during the Middle Ages were well aware that the earth was spherical. They had access to ancient Greek texts that clearly described a round earth, and medieval scholars built upon this knowledge rather than rejecting it. Universities across Europe taught spherical earth geography as established fact. The real intellectual debates of the medieval period weren't about the shape of the earth, but about its size and the feasibility of long-distance ocean travel. When critics challenged certain famous exploration plans, they weren't worried about ships falling off the edge of a flat world. They were correctly pointing out mathematical errors in distance calculations and arguing that the proposed voyages were longer and more dangerous than the explorers claimed. This myth about medieval flat earth beliefs was actually created centuries later by writers who wanted to portray their own era as more enlightened and rational than previous periods. They deliberately exaggerated medieval ignorance to make their contemporary achievements seem more impressive by comparison, creating a false historical narrative that has persisted in popular consciousness despite being thoroughly debunked by actual historical evidence. The persistence of these fabrications reveals something profound about how human societies construct and maintain their understanding of the past. We don't just passively receive historical information, we actively shape it to serve our psychological and cultural needs. These lies survived because they told us stories we wanted to hear about human achievement, natural phenomena, corporate success, and intellectual progress. Progress. Our 10th and final deception brings us to one of the most tragic maritime disasters in history, where corporate marketing met journalistic sensationalism to create a narrative that was more dramatic than reality. The story of this legendary ocean liner has become the ultimate symbol of human arrogance, colliding with the unforgiving forces of nature. Central to this tale is the claim that the shipping company brazenly advertised their vessel as completely unsinkable, setting up the perfect ironic tragedy when it met its icy fate in the North Atlantic. This narrative element has become so embedded in how we understand the disaster that it's impossible to imagine the story without it. The unsinkable ship sinking on its maiden voyage represents the pinnacle of dramatic irony, a perfect example of pride preceding a fall. It's the kind of storytelling that writes itself, which should have been our first clue that something wasn't quite right about this version of events. The shipping company never actually used the word unsinkable in their promotional materials. Their marketing language was far more cautious, describing the vessel as practically unsinkable, which represents a massive difference in both legal liability and actual meaning. It's the corporate equivalent of saying a device is water-resistant versus waterproof, a distinction that lawyers and insurance companies take very seriously. The unsinkable label was primarily applied by newspapers and magazines after the disaster occurred, because unsinkable ship sinks makes for a much more compelling headline than practically unsinkable ship encounters unexpected circumstances and suffers tragic loss of life. The media transformation of careful corporate language into absolute claims created a narrative that was more satisfying from a storytelling perspective, even if it wasn't historically accurate. This pattern of journalistic embellishment reveals how disasters become legends through the process of retelling. Each version of the story gets slightly more dramatic, more ironic, more perfectly structured as a moral lesson about human hubris. The real tragedy was horrible enough without editorial enhancement, but apparently the actual facts weren't quite dramatic enough for newspaper sales and popular consumption. Moving from maritime disasters to ancient royal intrigue, our understanding of one of history's most famous queens has been shaped more by Hollywood casting decisions than historical evidence. The legendary Egyptian ruler who seduced two of Rome's most powerful leaders has become synonymous with exotic beauty and feminine manipulation, representing the ultimate femme fatale of the ancient world. Popular culture has consistently portrayed this queen as breathtakingly beautiful, using her physical appearance as her primary weapon in political negotiations with Roman generals and politicians. This image has become so central to her story that most people would struggle to imagine her any other way. She's been depicted by some of the most beautiful actresses in film history, reinforcing the connection between her political success and her supposed physical perfection. The historical evidence suggests a completely different reality. First, she wasn't even Egyptian in any meaningful sense. She was the descendant of one of Alexander the Great's generals, who had established a Greek dynasty in Egypt centuries earlier. Her family had been ruling Egypt for nearly 300 years, but they remained culturally and ethnically Greek throughout that entire period. More importantly, contemporary coins and sculptures suggest she was not conventionally beautiful by either ancient or modern standards. Archaeological evidence shows a woman with strong, prominent features that were more striking than traditionally attractive. Her real power came from her intellectual abilities, political acumen, and personal charisma rather than physical beauty. She spoke multiple languages fluently, was educated in mathematics, philosophy, and rhetoric, and possessed the kind of strategic thinking that allowed her to maintain Egypt's independence during one of the most turbulent periods in Mediterranean history. Her relationships with Roman leaders were political alliances based on mutual benefit, not romantic entanglements driven by irresistible physical attraction. The transformation of this brilliant political strategist into a beautiful seductress reflects our tendency to reduce complex historical figures into simple, easily digestible narratives. A story about intellectual prowess and diplomatic skill is harder to visualize and market than a tale of beauty conquering powerful men through feminine wiles. From ancient queens to medieval torture devices, our next fabrication involves one of the most terrifying contraptions ever associated with historical punishment. The Iron Maiden has become the ultimate symbol of medieval cruelty, a human-shaped sarcophagus lined with spikes designed to slowly impale victims while keeping them alive for maximum suffering. This device appears in horror movies, haunted house attractions, and heavy metal album covers as the epitome of sadistic medieval justice. The visual impact of the Iron Maiden is undeniable. It combines claustrophobia, pain, and the grotesque imagery of being slowly pierced by multiple spikes in a confined space. The device seems to perfectly capture everything we imagine about medieval brutality, representing a time when human life was cheap and torture was both public entertainment and judicial procedure. The problem with this terrifying symbol of medieval justice is that it never existed during the Middle Ages. There is absolutely no historical evidence that Iron Maidens were ever used as torture devices in medieval Europe. The contraption was actually created in the late 18th century, most likely as a museum piece designed to shock and entertain visitors with Gothic horror. The Iron Maiden was essentially the historical equivalent of a haunted house prop, created during a period when people had become fascinated with medieval history and wanted to experience thrills from imagining the brutal past. Museum curators discovered that displaying horrifying torture devices drew crowds and generated revenue, so they began commissioning artisans to create increasingly elaborate and disturbing contraptions. This fake torture device became so associated with medieval punishment that it influenced how people understood the entire historical period. The Middle Ages certainly had their share of brutal execution and torture methods, but they didn't need this over-the-top theatrical contraption that was designed centuries later purely for entertainment value. Our understanding of culinary history has been similarly distorted by national pride and cultural competition, particularly when it comes to the origins of beloved dishes. One of the most popular items on American Chinese restaurant menus carries the name of a famous military leader, suggesting an authentic connection to traditional Chinese cuisine and regional history. This sweet and spicy dish has become so associated with Chinese food in America that most people assume it represents authentic traditional cooking from the Hunan province. The military connection adds an air of historical authenticity, suggesting that this recipe has been passed down through generations and carries cultural significance beyond mere flavor preferences. The reality is that this dish was invented in the 1970s by a chef working in New York City who wanted to create something that would appeal specifically to American taste preferences. The recipe combines elements that American diners found appealing: sweet sauce, fried coating, and familiar chicken, rather than representing any authentic regional Chinese cooking tradition. If you traveled to the Hunan province and asked for this dish by name, you would receive blank stares from restaurant staff who have never heard of it. The famous military leader it's supposedly named after probably never ate anything remotely resembling this American creation, which would have seemed as foreign to him as a hamburger or pizza. This culinary fabrication represents a broader pattern of how immigrant communities adapt their traditional foods to local tastes while maintaining cultural branding that suggests authenticity. The result is hybrid cuisine that serves the practical purpose of running successful restaurants while creating false impressions about traditional food culture. From modern culinary myths to ancient literary epics, our next deception involves one of the most famous military strategies in classical history. The story of the wooden horse gift has become synonymous with brilliant tactical deception, representing the triumph of cunning over brute force in warfare. This tale has inspired military strategists, political theorists, and computer security experts who use the term to describe hidden threats disguised as harmless offerings. The image of Greek soldiers hiding inside a massive wooden horse while their enemies wheel it inside their impregnable city walls represents the ultimate example of psychological warfare. The story demonstrates how creative thinking can overcome seemingly impossible military obstacles, turning an enemy's assumptions and cultural practices against them in spectacular fashion. Most historians now believe that the famous wooden horse was a metaphorical description rather than a literal military device. The horse was most likely a poetic way of describing a siege engine, battering ram, or other mechanical device that finally breached the city's defenses. Ancient epic poetry often used symbolic language and metaphorical descriptions that weren't meant to be interpreted literally. Alternatively, the horse might have represented an earthquake, since the god associated with horses was also the deity of seismic activity. The destruction of the city walls through natural disaster could have been poetically described as a gift from this god, which later storytellers transformed into the literal wooden construction we know today. The transformation of practical military engineering or natural disaster into an elaborate deception story demonstrates how historical events become legends through the process of poetic retelling. The metaphorical horse made for much better entertainment than the reality of patient siege warfare or geological catastrophe, so that's the version that survived in popular memory. These 10 massive deceptions reveal a pattern that extends far beyond simple historical inaccuracy. They show us how human societies actively construct the past to serve present psychological, cultural, and commercial needs. We don't just want information about what happened. We want stories that entertain us, confirm our beliefs, and provide satisfying moral lessons about human nature and social progress. The persistence of these lies demonstrates something profound about how we process and retain information. Dramatic, emotionally satisfying narratives will always triumph over boring but accurate facts in the competition for mental real estate. We remember the stories that make us feel something, even when logic and evidence clearly contradict them. Perhaps most disturbing is how these fabrications reveal the gap between what we think we know and what actually happened in the past. If 10 of our most confident historical facts are complete nonsense, what does that say about the reliability of everything else we've been taught? How many other cherished beliefs are built on foundations of creative storytelling rather than solid evidence? The answer might be more unsettling than we're prepared to acknowledge. History, it turns out, is less about preserving the past than about creating stories that serve the present. And we've all been willing participants in this collective act of creative remembering. What makes these revelations even more troubling is how they expose the machinery behind historical myth-making. Each fabrication followed a similar pattern of creation, amplification, and cultural embedding that reveals the systematic nature of how false information becomes accepted truth. Understanding this process helps explain why so many other questionable historical claims continue to circulate unchallenged. The creation phase typically begins with someone who has a specific agenda, whether it's selling newspapers, promoting national pride, marketing products, or simply making boring reality more entertaining. There's always an underlying motivation for transforming mundane truth into compelling fiction. These initial fabricators rarely set out to deceive future generations. They're usually just trying to solve an immediate problem or capitalize on a present opportunity. The amplification phase occurs when these fabricated stories get picked up and repeated by people who have no reason to question their authenticity. Teachers, journalists, documentary filmmakers, and casual storytellers all become unwitting accomplices in spreading misinformation simply because the stories sound reasonable and serve their own purposes. A teacher needs interesting examples to keep students engaged. A documentary needs dramatic footage to maintain viewer attention. A journalist needs compelling headlines to sell papers. The cultural embedding phase happens when these stories become so widely accepted that questioning them seems absurd or even offensive. They get incorporated into textbooks, reference materials, and popular culture until they achieve the status of common knowledge. At this point, the fabrications become self-reinforcing because anyone who challenges them appears to be contradicting obvious facts that everyone else already knows. This process explains how completely ridiculous claims can persist for decades or even centuries, despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary. Once a lie achieves cultural embedding, it becomes remarkably resistant to correction because debunking it requires people to admit they've been fooled, which triggers psychological defense mechanisms that make them more likely to reject new evidence rather than acknowledge their error. The speed of modern information systems has dramatically accelerated this cycle of myth creation and acceptance. Stories that once took generations to become embedded in popular consciousness can now achieve global acceptance within days or weeks through social media amplification. This creates an environment where historical fabrications can be manufactured and distributed faster than fact-checkers can debunk them. Consider how quickly certain modern myths have achieved widespread acceptance, despite being easily verifiable as false. The same psychological mechanisms that allowed people to believe in sewer alligators and impossible perpetual motion machines are now working overtime in our digital information ecosystem, creating new generations of historical lies that future scholars will have to debunk. The persistence of these myths also reveals uncomfortable truths about human cognitive limitations. We like to think of ourselves as rational beings who make decisions based on evidence and logical analysis. But the prevalence of historical fabrications suggests that we're actually much more influenced by storytelling, emotional appeal, and social consensus than we want to admit. Our brains seem to be wired to prefer narratives that make sense within our existing worldview, rather than facts that challenge our assumptions. We gravitate toward information that confirms what we already believe and actively resist data that forces us to reconsider our understanding of reality. This cognitive bias creates fertile ground for historical myths to take root and flourish. The educational implications of these revelations are staggering. If fundamental historical claims taught in schools around the world are completely fabricated, what does that say about the reliability of educational systems that are supposed to prepare people for informed citizenship? How can we trust institutions that have been unknowingly perpetuating lies for generations? The problem extends beyond simple factual errors into the realm of critical thinking skills. Students who are taught to memorize and repeat historical claims without questioning their sources or examining evidence are being trained to be passive consumers of information rather than active investigators of truth. This educational approach creates citizens who are vulnerable to manipulation by anyone skilled at crafting compelling narratives. The commercial exploitation of historical myths represents another disturbing dimension of this phenomenon. Entire industries have been built around fabricated historical claims, from tourism sites that capitalize on fictional events to educational materials that profit from spreading misinformation. The economic incentives to maintain these myths often outweigh the moral obligations to correct them. Museums, tour guides, and educational publishers all have financial reasons to preserve exciting historical lies, rather than replace them with boring historical truths. A museum exhibit about ancient torture devices will always draw bigger crowds than an honest display about actual medieval justice systems. A tour of locations where famous events supposedly occurred generates more revenue than admitting that those events never actually happened there. This creates a feedback loop where commercial interests actively resist historical accuracy because truth is bad for business. The result is an information ecosystem where lies are more profitable than facts, ensuring that myths will continue to be manufactured and maintained regardless of their impact on public understanding. The international dimension of historical fabrication adds another layer of complexity to this problem. Different countries often maintain conflicting versions of the same events, with each nation promoting narratives that make their ancestors look heroic and their enemies appear villainous. These competing mythologies create diplomatic tensions and cultural misunderstandings that can persist for generations. When national identity becomes tied to specific historical narratives, correcting those narratives becomes politically impossible, even when evidence clearly demonstrates their inaccuracy. Politicians who acknowledge that beloved national myths are fabricated risk being accused of treason or cultural betrayal, creating powerful incentives to maintain lies rather than confront uncomfortable truths. The psychological comfort provided by historical myths explains much of their persistence in the face of contradictory evidence. These stories often serve important emotional and social functions that have nothing to do with their factual accuracy. They provide shared cultural references, reinforce group identity, and offer reassuring explanations for complex phenomena. Admitting that cherished historical beliefs are false requires people to confront the possibility that other fundamental assumptions about reality might also be wrong. This prospect is so psychologically threatening that many individuals would rather maintain comforting lies than face potentially destabilizing truths about the unreliability of human knowledge and institutional authority. The technological tools now available for historical research should theoretically make it easier to separate fact from fiction, but they also create new opportunities for sophisticated fabrication. Digital manipulation capabilities allow modern mythmakers to create convincing fake evidence that can fool even trained experts, while global communication networks enable rapid distribution of misinformation before verification systems can respond. The democratization of information publishing means that anyone can now create and distribute historical claims without the traditional gatekeeping mechanisms that once provided some protection against obvious fabrications. While this has many benefits for legitimate researchers and educators, it also creates an environment where historical lies can multiply and spread more rapidly than ever before. The cumulative effect of these widespread historical fabrications goes beyond simple misinformation into the realm of epistemological crisis. If we cannot trust basic historical claims that have been accepted for generations, how can we have confidence in any knowledge systems? What distinguishes reliable information from elaborate fiction when both can be supported by apparently credible sources and expert endorsement? This uncertainty creates fertile ground for conspiracy theories and radical skepticism that can undermine social cohesion and democratic institutions. When people lose faith in the reliability of established knowledge, they become vulnerable to manipulation by anyone offering alternative explanations, regardless of how bizarre or destructive those alternatives might be. The solution to this crisis requires more than simply correcting individual false claims. It demands a fundamental shift in how we approach historical knowledge, moving from passive acceptance of authoritative pronouncements toward active investigation of evidence and critical evaluation of sources. This transition requires significant changes in educational systems, media practices, and public discourse that will be difficult to implement, but essential for maintaining an informed democratic society. The 10 massive lies we've examined represent just the tip of an enormous iceberg of historical misinformation that shapes our understanding of human civilization. Each fabrication teaches us something important about the gap between what we think we know and what actually happened in the past. More importantly, they reveal the ongoing processes through which new myths are being created and embedded in contemporary culture. Recognizing these patterns of deception doesn't just help us correct past errors. It provides tools for identifying and resisting current attempts to manufacture historical narratives that serve political, commercial, or ideological agendas. The same mechanisms that convince people to believe in impossible perpetual motion machines and magical absinthe hallucinations are still operating today, creating new generations of lies that future historians will have to debunk. The stakes of this ongoing battle between truth and fiction continue to escalate as information technology becomes more sophisticated and global communication systems become more pervasive. Our ability to distinguish between reliable historical knowledge and elaborate storytelling will determine whether human societies can maintain the shared understanding of reality necessary for effective cooperation and democratic governance. The choice we face is clear, but not easy. We can continue accepting comfortable lies that confirm our existing beliefs and provide emotionally satisfying narratives about human achievement and progress. Or we can embrace the more difficult path of questioning authority, examining evidence, and accepting uncomfortable truths about the limitations of human knowledge and the unreliability of institutional claims. The 10 fabrications we've explored today demonstrate that the second path, while more challenging, is the only one that leads toward genuine understanding of our shared human experience. The alternative is a world where truth becomes indistinguishable from fiction, where knowledge becomes impossible, and where societies lose the to learn from actual history rather than invented mythology. Every time we choose to investigate rather than assume, to question rather than accept, and to seek evidence rather than rely on authority, we take a small step toward a more honest understanding of the past and a more informed approach to the future. The lies that have shaped our historical consciousness for generations can only be overcome through the patient work of countless individuals committed to truth over comfort, accuracy over entertainment, and evidence over ideology. Comfort, accuracy over entertainment, and evidence over ideology. The recognition that these historical fabrications have shaped our understanding for generations raises a disturbing question about the nature of knowledge itself. If 10 fundamental claims that millions of people learned in school are completely fabricated, what does that suggest about the thousands of other historical facts we accept without question? The systematic nature of these deceptions reveals something profound about how human societies construct their understanding of the past. Each of these lies succeeded because they fulfilled specific psychological needs that had nothing to do with historical accuracy. We wanted to believe that ancient achievements were visible from space because it made human accomplishment seem more impressive. We embrace stories about sewer monsters because urban legends provide a thrilling sense of hidden danger in familiar places. We accepted tales of global conspiracies because they offer simple explanations for complex world events. The fabrication process itself follows predictable patterns that help explain why these myths became so deeply embedded in popular consciousness. Someone with a specific agenda creates an initial story that serves their immediate needs, whether that's selling newspapers, promoting tourism, or making boring reality more entertaining. These original fabricators rarely intend to deceive future generations. They're simply solving present problems or capitalizing on current opportunities. The story then gets amplified by people who have no reason to question its authenticity. Teachers need engaging examples to maintain student attention. Documentary filmmakers require dramatic footage to keep audiences interested, and journalists want compelling headlines that will sell papers or generate clicks. Each retelling adds new details and removes inconvenient complications until the fabricated version becomes more polished and memorable than whatever mundane truth it replaced. Eventually, these stories achieve cultural embedding, becoming so widely accepted that questioning them seems absurd or even offensive. They get incorporated into textbooks, reference materials, and popular culture until they achieve the status of common knowledge. At this point, the fabrications become self-reinforcing, because anyone who challenges them appears to be contradicting obvious facts that everyone else already knows. This process explains how completely ridiculous claims can persist for decades or centuries, despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary. Once a lie achieves cultural embedding, it becomes remarkably resistant to correction, because debunking it requires people to admit they've been fooled, which triggers psychological defense mechanisms that make them more likely to reject new evidence rather than acknowledge their error. The speed of modern information systems has dramatically accelerated this cycle of myth creation and acceptance. Stories that once took generations to become embedded in popular consciousness can now achieve global acceptance within days or weeks through social media amplification. This creates an environment where historical fabrications can be manufactured and distributed faster than fact-checkers can debunk them. Consider how certain modern myths have achieved widespread acceptance despite being easily verifiable as false. The same psychological mechanisms that allowed people to believe impossible claims about ancient architecture and underground reptile colonies are now working overtime in our digital information ecosystem, creating new generations of historical lies that future scholars will have to debunk. The persistence of these myths reveals uncomfortable truths about human cognitive limitations. We like to think of ourselves as rational beings who make decisions based on evidence and logical analysis. But the prevalence of historical fabrications suggests that we're actually much more influenced by storytelling, emotional appeal, and social consensus than we care to admit. These 10 spectacular deceptions prove that history isn't just written by the victors, it's rewritten by anyone with a good story and enough persistence. The next time someone confidently states a historical fact, remember that our collective memory has been shaped by marketing campaigns, documentary filmmakers with no scruples, and centuries of people who thought reality needed better editing. Question everything, because apparently we've all been failing the fact-checking test for generations.